This is a very concerning topic, so I am going to apologize right away. We are going to show graphic images. We've tried to do this just as discreetly as we could. However, these are images that children are seeing in schools, and so we need to be aware of what's going on. So I just want to put that disclaimer out there. So tonight, my focus is going to be to talk about comprehensive sex education and gender ideology. First of all, our goals for tonight, my presentation, is just to inform you about the New York State legislation that's pending right now regarding these issues, as well as to inform you about the harmful messages that the National Sex Education Standards are teaching, and then hopefully to encourage you to continue to learn more after this presentation, as well as to get involved with your community. Just so you know where I come from, Feed My Sheep Foundation is a Christian organization, and as an organization we believe that children need to be protected, that stable parents and families are the primary protectors of their children, that we were all created either male or female, and that we need to treat everyone with compassion. And we also believe that educational institutions should respect and support the parents being sensitive to their cultural and religious beliefs. So this is what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to first of all look at what is happening. I'll give you some examples of things that are happening across New York State, as well as looking at the New York State legislation. We will also take a look at the National Sex Ed Standards. I'll give you examples of those standards, and we will also look to the curriculums that conform to those standards so that you can see what's being taught in the schools. We'll also talk about why this matters. We'll look at the effectiveness of the comprehensive sex ed programs, and we'll also look at the harms that are related to both gender ideology and comprehensive sex ed. I'll also talk about some of the benefits that are missing from the National Sex Ed Standards because they don't really talk about abstinence. And then finally, we will talk about what we can do about this. So before I begin, it's really important to understand that we are actually talking about two separate issues tonight: comprehensive sex ed, or what I might refer to as CSE, and then gender ideology. So comprehensive sex ed is not what you would typically think about when we think about childhood sex ed in school, okay? It's different, and we'll go over that. Gender ideology is a separate issue. However, comprehensive sex ed teaches gender ideology, so they do overlap quite a bit. However, what we are finding is that you can have a school that promotes gender ideology in different ways, even if they don't have comprehensive sex ed in their schools. And you can see a couple of examples of this as I go along. Okay. So one of the things that we get asked all the time is, well, this isn't really happening, or what schools is this happening in? And so to start off with, I'm just going to give you guys some examples all the way from elementary schools to college and from city schools to rural schools, just so that you get a picture of some of the things that are happening. So first of all, at Pittsford Central School, their code of conduct for this year states that students, parents, guardians, and staff members should report any concern of harassment based on LGBTQIA+ status to administration immediately so that the alleged misconduct can be addressed and corrective action up to and including discharge of an employee or suspension of a student may be taken at once. Now, I think all of us would agree here, nobody should be harassed. The problem is that we're seeing that based on school policies, they get to decide what is harassment and what is discrimination. So for example, my colleague has a friend who is a teacher in Indiana, and he thought that the way that he could very kind of graciously deal with gender ideology is just to call all of his students by their last name. This way he was treating everybody fairly. Well, he was forced to leave because of this, and he actually did fight it in a lawsuit, and he lost. So he has lost his job because he was trying to treat everybody the same. So again, it just kind of depends on the school policies that we're seeing. Also, at SUNY Geneseo, there was a student, Owen Stevens, and not even related to classwork or anything like this, on his social media he posted that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. But because he was going into the semester for his student teaching, the Dean of School of Education said that his public position is in conflict with the Dignity for All Students Act, requiring teachers to maintain a classroom environment protecting the mental and emotional well-being of all students. So therefore, he was suspended that semester and wasn't allowed to do his student teaching. They did just recently let him back into school, and I believe he can actually finish his student teaching. So besides school policies that we can see things like gender ideology being brought into the school, we actually can see that there are activist teachers in the school districts. So for example, Spectrum News last year talked about a teacher in Brooklyn, a music teacher, Eric Williamson, who led students in songs about preferred gender pronouns. And what we're seeing is that this isn't just happening in some of the bigger city schools. Livonia Central Schools, this is a rural school near where I live, and we, just in the recent board meeting this month, parents came out and shared what their children had seen at the school, what was going on. So for example, a sixth grade math teacher was showing transgendered videos in class, and then also an 8th grade English teacher made the students sit down in a circle and talk about transgenderism, even though the children did not want to talk about it. After being pushed a bit, the children did share their opinions about it, and the teacher started, she got very emotional, and she called their opinions discrimination, and she brought in counselors to basically reteach them and correct them about their opinions. We're also seeing that activist organizations are bringing in information to the children by donating books on comprehensive sex ed and gender ideology. So this organization, Hope in a Box, this is a New York charity. They do work nationwide. So their goal is to equip educators with LGBTQ inclusive books, curriculums, training, and mentorship. And their mission is to help rural public schools. Now, as you can see, it's kind of a little blurry, but there's a little map there. So again, they do donate books nationwide, but I was trying to focus on just their impact in New York. So their impact is that they have already donated to 40 schools. And you can see there's a picture of a book, It Feels Good to Be Yourself. I will be reading from that book in just a little bit, just so that you can see what's being donated to schools. I tried to ask them which schools they actually had donated to, and this was the response that I got from Joe English, the founder of the organization. He said, "We keep the specific names of member schools confidential for privacy reasons, but I can share that the vast majority are in upstate and western New York," so this area, "and most identify as rural and or low-income Title I schools. We have more than 20 New York schools on our wait list today and have more joining every week." We're also seeing that kids are learning about gender ideology through after-school clubs. So for example, this Pittsford Elementary School, the superintendent said just this month at another board meeting that they are basically considering the proposals for the Rainbow Clubs, and this is for 2 elementary schools. Also, again, I spoke to a parent at the Livonia Central School, and she told me that recently her child came home with a picture of some of the posters that were on the wall, and it turns out that the Gay and Straight Alliance leader spearheaded making transgender celebration posters, but none of the parents were informed that any of this would be going on in the school. Also, my colleague Carrie, she used to be a counselor in a local Rochester suburban school, and she had found that gender ideology is being taught through things like bullying prevention or in the counseling office, that the counselors are supposed to affirm new gender identities that the children come in with, and that's because of the Dignity for All Students Act that they're expected to do this. Now, my colleague was feeling very convicted about this. She doesn't agree with what's happening right now, and so that was just one of the contributing factors for why she ended up leaving that job. So she's definitely seen this firsthand. Also, I know we've been talking a lot about gender ideology. Those are just some examples to show you that this can show up in schools, even if the school isn't teaching comprehensive sex ed. However, comprehensive sex ed is currently being taught in New York State schools. So this post-standard article that came earlier this year says that in the Syracuse City School District, sex ed is taught in the middle and high schools as part of the curriculum and health classes, but some of its teachers rely on outside organizations like REACH, CNY, to come into their classes. And what we're seeing is that these outside organizations, they're already picking and using curriculum that conforms to the National Sex Ed Standards, so they're already teaching comprehensive sex ed. We also know that Planned Parenthood is currently using this curriculum, Be Proud, Be Responsible, in several New York schools. And just keep that in mind, because this curriculum, because I'm going to be reading again some examples from this curriculum as well. So let's get into the legislation a little bit. Before we do though, it's important to realize that what the legislation will do is expand everything that we're already starting to see in culture. It's just that it's going to reduce the ability for individual schools to make decisions about what's in their school district. Now there are several pieces of legislation related to these issues. However, I'm going to address two of them that are most concerning. So right now, both of these pieces of legislation are still in committee. The first is a Senate Bill 2584A, and it has the same as bill in the Assembly 6616. This bill is going to require comprehensive sexuality education for students in grades K through 12, which includes a modal curricula for a comprehensive sexuality education, and at a minimum conforms to the content and scope of the National Sexuality Education Standards. So what this means is that if this bill is passed, the schools districts do not have control anymore about what they're teaching. They will be required to teach at a very minimum the National Sex Ed Standards, which is why I'm going to go through some of these standards tonight, okay? And so this is right now for all public and charter schools that we're seeing this. The second bill is in the Senate. It's 369, and then the same as bill in the Assembly is 840. This bill is going to ensure that schools and school employees treat students consistently with their gender identity or expression, including using pronouns and names consistent with the student's gender identity or expression. And as you're going to see in some of the books that I'm going to share, this can change day to day, and teachers are expected to keep up with it. This bill is also going to allow students to participate in sex-segregated activities and access sex-segregated facilities in a manner consistent with the student's gender identity or expression. So in other words, things like bathroom usage, overnight accommodations for field trips, sports, all of that stuff will no longer be designated based on a child's biological sex, but based on their gender identity. And then finally, this bill is going to protect students' privacy related to their transgender or gender non-conforming status. So what this means is that a child can go into the office and change their gender status on their school records, and their parents don't need to know. They have a right to privacy. So in short, this legislation is going to mandate that all local school districts create policies that affirm gender identity. Okay, now these two legislations are going to change many things, but I just want to highlight three things. First of all, it's going to decrease control at the local level. Oftentimes when we go to do a presentation like this, there are people who get very concerned that we're just school bashing, that we're against teachers. That is absolutely not true. We are here because we value our public schools. We value the opportunity for children to be able to go there. We value the work that the teachers do. This legislation will harm the schools because they will be losing control at the local level, and parents will also be losing a say in the school districts. So that is why we're here, is we do not want the school districts to be losing their control or the parents to be losing their say. Also, it's going to decrease job security for teachers. There are many teachers out there who do not agree with this gender ideology that's coming into schools, and yet they're going to have to forfeit their job if they're not willing to just go along and affirm transgenderism. Also, we can see that it's been happening already, that there are teachers who disagree with teaching the comprehensive sex ed, and the school kind of has a way around it that, oh, okay, you don't have to teach it, but we're going to bring somebody else in that will. And so again, that teacher's kind of in a hard place where, okay, they can keep their job, but it's still going to be taught in their school. Finally, this is also going to increase pressure on the children. I gave you one example of a college student who got suspended, but not only that, there are kids who are going to be incredibly embarrassed and are going to have to go through these comprehensive sex education classes, and this is just going to increase pressure on them. They're going to have to be, they're expected to promote the gender ideology of their peers and use pronouns and things like that too. So I'm sure that there are a lot more changes, but we just wanted to highlight these three. Okay, I do want to jump into the National Sex Ed Standards here. I just want to make a note that I am only talking about a very few of the standards, and so I do have a copy of the National Sex Ed Standards. You can download these off of online if you're interested in reading all of them. I also have a binder right here where we put together a PDF basically that walks through the National Sex Ed Standards. It gives you the standard, it gives you the page number, and we've broken it down by category. So you can look at that and you can see what talks about abortion, what talks about sexual autonomy, what talks about critical race theory. We've even thrown that in there. So we basically broke down the National Sex Ed Standards so you can really quickly at a glance see what's in there. The National Sex Ed Standards were created by these organizations. Why this is important is because we know from these organizations that the National Sex Ed Standards have been created with an agenda in mind. For example, CKIS's slogan is Sex Ed for Social Change, and Advocates for Youth, their slogan is Young, Powerful, Taking Over. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples just as we go along through the presentation that you can see where their agenda kind of pops out a bit. But the point is that these organizations, their main purpose for the National Sex Ed Standards is to change our culture and our society through our children. So that's really important to know about. And just remember, we are going over these because if these bills pass, this is going to be what's required to be taught in schools. We're going to look at the kindergarten through second grade standards. So this is when children are 5 to 7 years old. They are expected to define gender, gender identity, and gender role stereotypes. So gender identity is expressed as how an individual identifies themselves based on their internal understanding of their gender. Some gender identities may include female, male, agender, androgynous, genderqueer, non-binary, transgender, and many more or some combination thereof. So this first example of a book I'm going to show you, this conforms to these standards. It is being read in schools, and this is actually for pre-K and older. So this is the book, Who Are You? It says, babies can't talk, so grown-ups make a guess by looking at their bodies. This is the sex assigned to you at birth, male or female. Sometimes people get this confused with gender, but gender is much more than the body that you were born with. Some people say there are only 2 genders, but there's really many genders. You are who you say you are because you know you best. These are just a few words people use: trans, genderqueer, non-binary, gender fluid, transgender, gender neutral, agender, neutrois, bigender, third gender, two-spirit, and there are even more words people are using to describe their experience. And again, I just want to remind you, this is for pre-K. There is this fun wheel at the end of the book that the kids get to use, and the inner circle talks about, I have a body that made adults guess that I was a boy or guess that I was a girl. The second wheel says, I identify as, and again, there's a whole list of things that they can choose from, non-binary, agender, and so forth. And then the last wheel is how they like to express their gender expression. So things like tutus or scarves or so forth. This next example should look familiar. This is one of the books that Hope in a Box is already distributing, and it's called It Feels Good to Be Yourself. When people guess wrong, it is okay to let them know. Ruthie was 5 when she told her parents, I know you think I am a boy, but really I feel like a girl. Oops, Ruthie was a girl all along, they just didn't know it at first. You might feel like a boy, you might feel like a girl, you might feel like both boy and girl, or like neither. You might feel like your gender changes from day to day or from year to year. You might feel that none of these words describes you perfectly. You might not be sure yet, you might be figuring it out. And this book too is also for pre-K and older. So let's look at the standards for the 3rd through 5th graders. So this is when a child is 8 to 11 years old. They are expected to describe the role hormones play in the physical, social, cognitive, and emotional changes during adolescence, and that's great. These kids are just starting to hit adolescence and they need to know what's happening in their bodies. But they are also expected to understand the potential role of hormone blockers on young people who identify as transgender. So now at this age, we're teaching them that there are things that you can take that can actually slow down your puberty or stop it. So we're giving that as an option to them. They are also expected to explain gender expression and that gender identity exists along a spectrum. They are also expected to explain common human sexual development and the role of hormones. So for example, romantic and sexual feelings, masturbation, mood swings, and timing of pubertal onset. So in this book, this chapter explains how to masturbate, and it makes a point of sexual pleasure. It states that some religions call masturbation a sin, but masturbating cannot hurt you. In the research that I have done, I definitely know that there are ways that masturbation can hurt you. It also explains orgasm, and it also says that some people become sexually excited without masturbating just by looking at sexual pictures. So already we are introducing the concept of pornography to children. So for grades 6 through 8, this is when children are about 12 to 14 years old, they are expected to define vaginal, oral, and anal sex, to explain that there are many methods of short and long-term contraception that are safe and effective, and describe how to access them. They are expected to explain the impact that media, including sexually explicit media, can have on one's body image and self-esteem. This book, It's Perfectly Normal, conforms to these standards. This book is suggested for the 5th graders. I am going to warn you, there are graphic images. Within this book, there is a picture of a little boy masturbating and a little girl masturbating. We have covered up the images, however, they are not covered in the book itself. So in this book, this chapter explains how to masturbate, and it makes a point of sexual pleasure. It states that some religions call masturbation a sin, but masturbating can. It should be clear that you have organizations like Planned Parenthood who created these National Sex Ed Standards, and now they're teaching children how to use their services. This is one point where we can see that this is agenda-driven. Also, several of the organizations that created the National Sex Ed Standards, they are pro-pornography and they are pro-sex work. So the idea of teaching sexually explicit media to children at this age is just grooming them for that. Again, this is another point where we can see their agenda coming through. Also at this age, children are taught about agency. I'm not going to go into it just because we have a video on our website that discusses it in more detail, but the idea of agency is teaching a child at this age that they know when they are ready to engage in sexual activity, that they know, they'll have that feeling that they know when they're ready. So that's what agency is. It's Perfectly Normal, again, conforms to these curriculum standards, and again, I just warn you that there are graphic images. So in a chapter on a kind of sharing, cuddling, kissing, touching, and sexual intercourse, there are 3 images of intercourse, 1 with a heterosexual couple and 2 with a homosexual couple. Again, we have blocked out some of the images, but they're not in the book. There are several versions of this book because this is an incredibly popular book, and so it has been updated. And so I think from one of the newer versions, these are the images that you would find in the book. So this is on the chapter about making love, sexual intercourse. Again, we have blocked out some of the images. They are not blocked out in the book. In this chapter, it says that there are several things about sex and sexual intercourse that are important to know and remember, and they list several things. However, among the list, it includes that sexual intercourse or having sex can involve the penis and the vagina, or the mouth and the genitals, or the penis and the anus. This curriculum, The Genderbread Person, teaches the children at this age that their gender identity is in their brain, that their attraction is in their heart, that their biological or anatomical sex is in their genitals, and that their gender expression is what they wear and the activities that they like doing. This lesson teaches children that everything is a spectrum, including their anatomical sex, which I still haven't figured that one out yet. Also, sex assigned at birth, they encourage the children to choose their sex assigned at birth, so either female, intersex, or male. For the 9th through 10th graders, they are expected to describe effective ways to communicate consent, personal boundaries, and that's awesome. We want kids to know that they have every right to say no, that they have personal boundaries, that other people should not be breaking through those boundaries and need to respect those boundaries. The problem is that this conversation about consent is also being taught in conjunction with teaching kids how to communicate their personal desires as it relates to intimacy, pleasure, and sexual behavior. So what we're seeing is that the National Sex Ed standards are sex positive. They are sex positive at any age, as long as you have agency. It is sex positive with any person, regardless of their age or gender, as long as they consent. And it is sex positive about any sexual behavior, as long as you have agency and consent, and as long as you are reducing your risk for things like pregnancy or STDs. So the National Sex Ed standards are definitely focused on pleasure and being sex positive. This curriculum, which we saw already earlier, that is being taught in New York State, this is Be Proud, Be Responsible. I just want to share a couple of examples with you. Some of the lessons say that people often say that sex doesn't feel good without a condom, but we're going to talk about ways to make the experience more pleasurable. So again, the emphasis on pleasure. Another lesson, touching and stroking each other all over can be very pleasurable. People who are better lovers know about their own bodies and a partner's body. So again, emphasis on pleasure. And then also, the goal of this role play is for Lee to convince Jaden to use a condom, and that condoms can be fun and pleasurable. And in this curriculum, which we already know is being used in New York, teachers are told, do not let your children sit out of the role play. If they come to you and say that they are uncomfortable, you need to encourage them to go through the role play anyway. Continuing with grades 9 through 10, they are expected to demonstrate the steps to using barrier methods correctly, so things like external and internal condoms and dental dams. They're supposed to identify medically accurate sources of information about and local services that provide contraceptive methods, including emergency contraception and condoms, and emergency and pregnancy options, including parenting, abortion, and prenatal care, and adoption and prenatal care, sorry. So this curriculum, Rights, Respect, and Responsibility, conforms to these standards. So if you notice, this is created by Advocates for Youth, also a creator of the National Sex Ed Standards. And in one of the lessons that they have here, the idea is for children to use penis models to learn how to put on condoms. Now this is geared in this curriculum for 9th graders. However, we've seen articles saying that this is being used as young as 5th grade. And so sometimes the way that this is geared is that there would be like 2 kids that would partner up and they would both practice together using things like condoms. And then also some other like fun activities, the way that the teachers try to make it fun and less embarrassing. Like they'll have the kids stand on one side of the room, race up to the front desk, put the condoms on the penis models, and then like go back and sit down. So in particular, in this lesson, it says before the next class, you need to visit one of these places, and the kids were giving a list of local places, and get a condom. In each situation, you must interact with at least one adult. I am hoping that you already have red flags going off in your brain that sending a child to go talk to another adult out in the community about sexual things is not a good idea. So to continue with a couple of examples from this curriculum, we have that students discuss the pros and cons of becoming a parent, putting a baby up for adoption, and having an abortion. Each of these options has reasons why someone would want to do it and reasons why someone would not want to do it. In the end, however, it is every pregnant person's, not woman's, but person's right to choose what they do with their pregnancy. That's for grade 9. Now for grade 10, one of the lessons that they teach is that if a clinic receives Title X funding, they must provide contraception without a parent or caregiver's consent. And what we're actually seeing is that a lot of these organizations and curriculums are teaching children not only to just get contraception without parents' knowledge or consent, but also how to have an abortion, how to gain medication like puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and how to even get sex reassignment surgeries without having to pay for it. The state will pay for it and your parents don't have to be involved. For grades 11 through 12, what we are seeing is just everything that we've already looked at, but more in depth. Now, this curriculum, again, Rights, Respect, and Responsibility, has a PowerPoint presentation, and the PowerPoint presentation teaches children that viewing sexually explicit media is not considered a negative by everyone. But people should keep in mind that it is fantasy and not reality. And in this PowerPoint presentation, there is image after image after image of the cover of porn magazines. So Playboy and GQ and things like that. We will not show them here. We don't think that's appropriate for anybody to be looking at, especially children. So in summary, comprehensive sex ed is agenda-driven. It includes sexually explicit materials. It's age inappropriate. Some of this stuff is just inappropriate for the school setting in general. It includes gender ideology and it's medically inaccurate. I want to just touch on two of these really quickly, it being age inappropriate and it being medically inaccurate. The reason why I want to touch on this is because oftentimes when people hear about this stuff, they say, no, it's not as bad as people say, and what they do is they go read the bill. Well, the bill about comprehensive sex education claims that it's age appropriate and that it's medically accurate. And so what people get in their mind is, well, these kids aren't hearing anything that they shouldn't be learning about at that age anyway, and it's all true. It's about their biology and reproduction and the things that kids need to learn about as they go through puberty. Hopefully you've seen from a few of the examples, and remember these are just a few examples that we've touched on, that this is age inappropriate. Some of it's even just inappropriate for the school setting in general. As far as medical inaccuracy goes, there's 2 points that I want to make. Because it includes the gender ideology, which teaches that you might be a boy brain in a female body, that's inaccurate. We know from biology that every viable cell in our bodies are either male or female. We also know that male brains develop differently than female brains. So besides that, what we're also seeing is that when they're talking about contraception, the kids are not getting the full story about some of the medical side effects that could happen with things like contraception or abortion. For example, that post-standard article that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there was a child who raised their hand and had asked, well, what are some of the side effects of the contraception that you're showing us? And the response was, well, everybody's body is differently, and so some people might have side effects and others don't. You just have to figure out what's right for you. So they're not actually expressing that there are side effects to contraception and things like abortion. They're not being clear with that. Now I just want to summarize what gender ideology teaches. So hopefully from some of the books in the curriculum, you can see that gender ideology teaches that gender is a choice. Gender can change from day to day. Your biological sex is meaningless. It's a guess. Remember, it was just assigned to you at birth. Color, clothing, and activity preferences define your gender. Kids can be born in the wrong body. Kids understand themselves and how they fit into the world at 5 years old, and they should correct their parents and other adults. Kids should focus on figuring out their gender identity, and you can be both a girl or a boy, or neither a boy or a girl, or some other choice. Now I want to talk about why this matters, and we're going to first talk about the effectiveness of comprehensive sex ed programs. So, the Institute for Research and Evaluation, they looked at 103 studies of comprehensive sex education in schools worldwide. What they looked at was over a 12-month time period, so 1 year, they looked at key indicators. So things like number of STDs, number of pregnancies, number of sexual partners, things like this. What they determined was if those numbers did what we want them to do, so for example, we want the number of STDs to decrease. If it does what we want it to do, then that is considered an effective program. If it does the opposite of what we want it to do, it increases instead of decreases, for example with STDs, then that is actually causing harm. So out of the 103 studies that the Institute looked at, 6% of the studies showed effectiveness, whereas 16% showed harm. And overall, they were seeing that 87% of those studies had no long-term effectiveness whatsoever. So the Institute concluded that some of the strongest, most current school-based CSE, or comprehensive sex ed studies worldwide, show very little evidence of real program effectiveness. I'd even go so far as to say they're seeing more harm than they are good. So let's actually talk about some of these harms. This slide is overwhelming. It's meant to be, just so that you can grasp just a little bit of some of the harms that are being caused by comprehensive sex ed and gender ideology. Tonight, I am going to talk to you about one from each one of these categories. So a physical, psychological, social, and spiritual harm. Okay, so the first one, a physical harm. When a child goes to a parent or a teacher or a medical personnel and they say, I do not feel like my biological sex, the parent, the teacher, the medical personnel are all being prompted to have that child start on a 4-step transition process. The first step is to socially transition, that they start changing their clothes, they start getting involved in activities that the other gender that they identify as what they would do. We are seeing closets popping up in schools so that a child can leave home. They go to school and they change in the closet and become another gender at the school, and then before they go home they change back so that their parents never have to know that they transition at school. Once a child socially transitions, they are prompted to start puberty blockers, and the reason for this is to give that child just a longer time to be able to figure out their gender identity before their puberty sets in. This is happening to kids as young as 8 years old. Now, in puberty, the hormones that our bodies create are not just there to develop sexual reproductive organs. Those hormones actually help develop other organs in our body. So for example, they actually help brain development. So what this means is that when we're putting children as young as 8 years old on puberty blockers, we're not just stalling their sexual reproduction, we are actually also stalling some other major organs that develop at this time as well. A majority of the kids who go on puberty blockers go on to cross-sex hormones. I don't remember the exact stat, but I believe it's close to 80% of the kids who start puberty blockers go on to cross-sex hormones. Now, cross-sex hormones, some of them have harmful side effects that will actually last the child the rest of their life. Just one quick example, women who get onto cross-sex hormones, their voice deepens. When they get off of the cross-sex hormones, that will never change. So there are some side effects that will stick for the rest of that person's life. The concerning part, though, is that cross-sex hormones, in conjunction with puberty blockers, will sterilize children. And so we're seeing kids as young as 13 years old who get onto cross-sex hormones and they're being sterilized. At 13 years old, you don't know if you're going to want kids. To make a decision like that is impacting the rest of their life. Finally, once the kids have gone through the cross-sex hormones, they are encouraged to do sex reassignment surgery. The idea here is that you've been taught that your sex was assigned at birth. It could be reassigned at any time. We're seeing girls as young as 13 who are removing healthy breast tissue, and boys around the age of 17 who are removing healthy genitals. So the idea here is that they are mutilating their healthy bodies because of this 4-step process that they are being encouraged to do. The reason why these children are being encouraged to go through this 4-step process is because the claim is that if you do not affirm their new gender identity, they will commit suicide. So this is the alternative. We know that that is not true. There are studies out there that have showed that if you do not affirm a child in their new gender identity, but you actually affirm that child as their biological sex, then over 90% of those kids that struggled with this will actually feel comfortable as their biological sex by the time they hit adulthood. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about those studies, you can take a look at the Parent Resource Guide. We have a resource list that is printed out as a handout for you in the table out in the lobby over there, and we have the link to that resource guide right on there if you're interested in learning more. Okay, next I want to look at a psychological harm. So what we're seeing is called rapid onset gender dysphoria. So traditionally, children who felt uncomfortable as their biological sex we were seeing this happening most in males, and the onset of it was in early childhood. It was considered a mental disorder. From the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for Mental Disorders in 2013, they saw that about 1 in 50,000 female children would have this disorder. 1 in 7,000 males would feel this discomfort. So as we can see, it's definitely a lot more in males than it is in females. However, what we are seeing today is that it's actually a larger number of females that are having this discomfort. The onset of it is in adolescence, and it's no longer considered a mental disorder. It's just a discomfort, and so socially we can kind of change you, we can address your biology and help you to get rid of that discomfort. The American College Health Association put out a statistic that in 2008, 1 in 2,000 female college students transitioned. Last year in 2021, 1 in 20 female students, college students transitioned. Now, there is what's considered to be a social contagion that is leading to this change. But what I'm concerned about tonight, just to emphasize here that this is a psychological issue, is that if this is not being addressed as a mental disorder anymore, these children are not getting the help and support that they need for mental health. And so that is incredibly concerning. We're seeing higher numbers of children with ADHD and autism who are also coming out as trans. So we can see that this is something that these children desperately need to be focused on what is actually happening, the mental disorder, the mental health issues that they need to focus on. Also, I mentioned this a little bit earlier when we were talking about the legislation and the changes that it would make, how it would add pressure to children. Well, just from a social aspect for these children, when it comes to comprehensive sex education, the embarrassment that goes into participating in these lessons and participating in the activities. So for example, I read one article where children were expected to hold a word on a sign up above their heads that they could not see, and those words could include anything from masturbation to oral sex to anal sex, anything like that. And all of the children in the classroom would sit in front of them and would shout out words and phrases and descriptive things that would help the kid holding the card to figure out what they're holding. So some of those teaching tactics are great teaching tactics that teachers use in classrooms, but it is absolutely not appropriate in this context. Now, not only that, but if this bill passes regarding the comprehensive sex education, you cannot opt your kids out anymore. Your kids will have to sit through the comprehensive sex education lessons. The only ones they can opt out of are the HIV and AIDS lessons. So what this means is that, as we have mentioned before, kids have boundaries. They can be taught to have boundaries as well. And yet what we're seeing is that we don't have to respect these kids' boundaries. They come to you and they say, I don't feel comfortable with this. You have to do it anyway. Well, why? Why would you make a kid do that? Well, because it normalizes talking about sexuality. It breaks down their boundaries and it sexualizes them. So doing things like those role-playing consent and role-playing how to use contraception and things like this, that is breaking down our children's boundaries and opening them up to the concept that it is okay and it is normal to have these types of conversations or to interact with my peers in this way, or, as we saw earlier, even interacting with adults in this way. Now, we are a Christian organization. It sounds like many of you are here too, and so we absolutely see that there are spiritual harms that comprehensive sex ed and gender ideology are affecting our children in a spiritual way. The first and foremost way is that it's teaching children to reject God's design. It's teaching them to reject what the Bible says about who we are and our identity, that we were created in God's image, that we are created either male or female, and that God has helped us with creating boundaries for our sexuality, boundaries that help keep us safe and healthy, and boundaries to help keep others safe and healthy. I just want to read this to you and share this. Psalm 139:13-14 says, "For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well." This is a very, very different message than what the kids are learning through comprehensive sex ed and gender ideology. They're learning that they're a mistake. That is not true. They're not a mistake. God created them and loves them. And so the Christian message is so much more powerful, it's so much more positive, and we shouldn't be afraid to teach our kids this. One last issue that I want to talk about on why this matters is that the National Sex Ed Standards are actually missing vital sex ed lessons about abstinence. So if you actually look at the National Sex Ed Standards, there are 165 standards. And 6 of them mention abstinence, but only as another method of birth control. None of them actually mention the proven benefits that saving sexual intercourse for a committed relationship, or even just delaying your sexual initiation, they don't talk about the benefits of that at all in the National Sex Ed Standards. Instead, what we're seeing is that their focus, 40 of these standards, is focusing on gender ideology and sexual orientation. So again, the National Sex Ed Standards are agenda-driven. They are focusing on teaching our kids this new ideology, this new way of looking at things, viewing sexuality from an anything-goes perspective, and they're not focusing on the well-being of the child. And yet, there are so many organizations out there that are promoting this comprehensive sex ed bill. Just real briefly, there are two general ways to teach sex education. So one is called sexual risk reduction. This is what comprehensive sex ed is. In other words, we know you're going to engage in sexual intercourse and sexual behaviors, and so what we're going to do is we're just going to help you reduce your risk of things like pregnancies and STDs and stuff like that. On the other hand, there's abstinence teaching. It's the idea of sexual risk avoidance, which means sexual activity comes with risks. And yet you can avoid all of those risks if you delay for a committed relationship, or if you delay even just your age of initiation. And yet what we're seeing is that organizations like New York Civil Liberties Union and plenty of other organizations, they are creating these legislative memos out there that are just constantly praising the comprehensive sex ed, and they are disparaging other ways of teaching sex education. So for example, in this legislative memo, it says that abstinence only until marriage programs are often presents medically inaccurate or incomplete information about contraception and safer sex practices. So here's what they mean. For example, programs receiving federal abstinence-only funding are required to instruct young people that sexual activity outside of marriage is likely to have harmful psychological and physical effects. So in other words, they don't believe that there are any harms to having sex outside marriage. These books that Brenda mentioned, these are free. Please take these. This just gives a very kind of big overview of what is happening globally with sexual culture, and it looks at the physical, emotional, social, and spiritual harms, and we absolutely talk about this, some of the harms that are from sex outside marriage. So what we're seeing is that the comprehensive sex ed bill is being pushed quite a bit by organizations that want to downplay the benefits of abstinence sex education. Now, just to share just a few things with you, this information came from Ascend, and so they have a packet out there about sexual risk avoidance and why it works. So this information, they say that findings from the study suggest that students who participate in the sexual risk avoidance programs experience these benefits: decreased teen pregnancy, decreased incidence of STDs, increased norms, attitudes, and intentions to wait for sex, usually until marriage, decreased levels of sexual initiation, increased self-esteem and self-efficacy, improved refusal and assertiveness skills against sexual pressure and assault, setting personal boundaries, and improved positive character qualities. And their list actually went on and went on and went on. And so I just wanted to share with you that there is an alternative. We don't have to use comprehensive sex ed to teach our children. There are other methods out there that actually are very beneficial. Okay, this has been probably an overload of information, and a lot of it has probably been pretty heartbreaking and depressing. And so I want to close here with some things that we can do. Now, I know many of you are probably very active already, and hopefully you guys are already doing this, but we just want to encourage you guys that there is something that we can do about this. So first of all, I encourage all of you to learn more after this presentation. Right now, we can still legally go to the school districts and we can ask to review their curriculum, we could ask to review specific lesson plans, and we can even sit in and observe our child's class. Okay, so we can take advantage of that right now and make sure that these things aren't happening in our local schools. I highly recommend that everybody who has a child in school, anywhere, regardless of what school your child is in, that you Become aware of education alternatives. This is not to disparage the public schools. I believe that parents are responsible for choosing the best form of education for their children, and so go and know what the options are. There are private schools, public schools, charter schools, home schools, micro schools, which are a combination of public and homeschooling. So there are a lot of different things out there. Not only just be aware of what your options are to educate your children, but also please be aware that there are other alternatives to educating your child about sex education. It doesn't have to be comprehensive sex ed. So I mentioned this resource list. You are welcome to take those handouts out there. This is basically just put together some information about ways that you can learn more. There are videos on here, articles on here, other websites and organizations. We're not the only organization doing this. Thankfully, there are others out there who are informing about this. So organizations like Protect Child Health Coalition and Family Watch International, there are great organizations that are doing stuff that can help us all learn more. Also, I would recommend that you speak out about this. First of all, that you speak to your own children or to just the children who are in your sphere of influence. Ask them, what have they learned? What are they learning in school? What do they believe about these concepts? Because maybe even if they aren't in the public schools hearing this yet, it's going to hit culture and they're going to hear about it at some point in time. So talk to them. What do they believe? What are their views? As a parent, go ahead and tell your child what your expectations are for their sexual health. You have a right to say, this is the standard that I would love for you to live by. These are the things that I believe are healthy and will help you and help you to make great decisions as you make decisions about things. Talk to your child about that. Also, talk to your child about, have they heard what the Christian message says? It is a much more positive message. Have they heard about it? Is that something that they can relate to, that they can understand that God created their identity? Also, we can talk to school boards. It sounds like some of you are also very active in this. You can go talk to a school board. These are the 3 things that I would recommend. First, I would make sure that you've done your homework and that you've checked out what is actually happening at the local school. So go review the curriculum, go talk to the teachers, go do what you need to do to figure out what's happening in your school district. I would write a short statement about your concerns. So just any of the harms that you're concerned about. You can talk about comprehensive sex ed or gender ideology. Make it so that it's about just 2 to 3 minutes to present. And then give the school board an alternative. So Protect Child Health Coalition has a 6-page document on their website with other alternatives for how to teach children about sex education. Also, this curriculum right here, which I can't read it because it's a little blurry. I believe it's the, oh boy. Yep, we have it right up there and I just can't read it. So that curriculum that you're looking for is a K through 12 standard for optimal sexual health. And this curriculum seems very promising. It seems like it's leaving room for people with Judeo-Christian values. So again, there are other curriculums out there that you can easily present to your board and say, please don't let comprehensive sex ed come in. Here's an alternative we would like you to review and take a look at. Also, you can speak to your legislators. New Yorkers for Constitutional Freedoms has just a very easy, wonderful website that talks about comprehensive sex ed, and it has like an email already set up for you that goes to the senators and the assemblymen. You can change what you need to in there. You can make a phone call. It's got all of the information right there. So that's on a separate resource page. This one, the presentation resources, is just kind of your quick click if you want to go directly to those things. The other resource page is just kind of the more general, like websites you want to peruse and read and learn more. So you can definitely talk to your legislators about this. Also, there are school districts that have parent Facebook pages. I think a lot of people have Facebook pages on their own anyway. This is a great place to share articles that you've read or share videos that you've read. I'm sure many of you are probably already doing this. Also, a lot of these organizations, they have packets, little pamphlet things like this, that you could very easily get several copies of these, or you can download these for free online and just email them to friends or pass them along. So there are lots of organizations out there that have literature that is just very easy to read. It's short, but it explains what's going on. I think the encouragement here tonight is to be engaged. So first of all, if you have kids in the school district, you can write your opt-out letters. now, before these bills are passed. You can opt your kids out of comprehensive sex education, and you also can opt your kids out of having to do with any of this gender ideology, that you don't want your children participating in that. Also, you can become a board member. So I know some of you, it sounds like, are involved in that, or you guys have members that are going to be doing that. I believe tomorrow is the date to file your petition for certain school districts. I think the smaller city schools don't have to file until the end of the month, but that would be one way that you can get involved. If you want to learn more information, you can go to New York State School Board Association, and it has plenty of information about things like voting on the budget on May 17th and how to run for school board. So that's just a good resource to see what that entails. And it also sounds like many of you are also part of We the People, that there are activist organizations out there in different communities and areas that are working very hard to inform people about what's going on, as well as to address the legislation. Okay, my final point for tonight is, I know that this feels just overwhelming, but we have to remember that God is bigger than this. He knows what's happening, and we have to remember that the Christian message is much more positive than what these children are hearing. And so these kids who are desperately seeking their identity, they're trying to figure out who they are, they're trying to build their own identity, they don't need all of that. They just need to know that Jesus loves them, that He created them, He gave them an identity, He has created a reality, and that for those kids who mutilated their body, or maybe they became sexually promiscuous, or they engaged in activities that are going to be harmful for their life, Jesus offers forgiveness and healing. And so we have nothing to be ashamed about as Christians with the message that we have to offer. This is what children are going to need to hear. And so I just pray that all of you guys, and me included, and I'm about an hour away in our area too, that the Christians in those areas are ready to give compassion and love to these kids who are really struggling, that are really unsure about what's going on, that we can be there to offer a more positive message and to bring them to Jesus. So let's please be in prayer about that. Okay, this is my last slide. So if you need any more of this information, our website is fmsfound.org. We also have a Facebook page. It's called Alliance to Protect New York's Children. And my colleague, Carrie, she moderates that. But basically, the Facebook page is just a platform where parents and community members can go and talk about these issues, get updates, and then she moderates it. So I think that is all I have for right now. And I do believe that we have some time for question and answer.
So we do have some time. If there's some questions out there, I'll bring the microphone back to you, and you can ask Bridgette, and we have a conversation. Do we have any questions?
This is Senate Bill 2584A, and it has the same as bill in the Assembly 6616. This bill is going to require comprehensive sexuality education for students in grades K through 12, which includes a modal curricula for comprehensive sexuality education, and at a minimum conforms to the content and scope of the National Sexuality Education Standards. So what this means is that if this bill is passed, the schools districts do not have control anymore about what they're teaching. They will be required to teach at a very minimum the National Sex Ed Standards, which is why I'm going to go through some of these standards tonight.